Yeah. Looking live. This will be the pre-show banter. I know we're live right now, but we'll test our microphones. Microphone check, audio check. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3.
Check a Rooney.
Check Rooney. Nobody on at this point in time, man. Dude, this is a scary subject. I know. I know there's a lot of things that I didn't know about it.
Well, and like we talked about when we were in the green room a moment ago, I have had the experts on our show. And if you're joining us, my name is Rich Brown, co-host, co-founder of the American Warrior Show. And in our show, Mike, like you said, we try to educate people on potential threats, right? And so I've had nuclear proliferation experts on here. I've had NASA physicists that do nothing but prepare our government for EMPs. And still, when I read the book we're going to talk about, it really altered the way I thought about this topic.
Yeah, man. Hey, folks, if you're jumping on, welcome to the show. Kind of an interesting show. Welcome to the live stream. Mike Seeklander and Rich Brown here, the founders of the American Warrior Society, of course, the creators of the American Warrior Show, as well as Rich says, the America's leading self-defense podcast. We're talking about a unique subject today, and that is specifically nuclear war. This is nuclear war part 1. We will do a nuclear war part 2. Nuclear war part 1 will cover in essence, some of the things you maybe didn't realize about the possibilities and the actual aspects of nuclear war. Now, full disclosure, this is not a happy subject. I just spent a 14-hour car ride with a couple of buddies talking to them about the things that I learned in a book that Rich is going to reference here in a second. And the reality is it's kind of a nasty subject. So why would we bring this to you in a day and age where news and everything else is so depressing? Because that's our job. So with me in terms of preparation and teaching firearm skills and tactics and combatives, and Rich doing the same thing, the American Warrior Society is all about preparation. We talked about COVID, pre-COVID. Rich Brown said, hey, I'm making a prediction. This thing is going to be worldwide. It's going to shut down almost everything. Get your food, get your hand sanitizer, get all these things. And guess what? A lot of folks didn't listen, but a lot of folks did listen because we actually put it out preemptively. This is going to be a unique show. And by the way, if you're jumping on and if you haven't done so, we're going to ask you politely, please click like and click share. One of the things that I've noticed is, and Rich, I don't know if we talked about this, that Facebook is shutting down notifications. Right now we have 11 people on live, where normally in 2 to 3 minutes I would have 60 or 70 people live right now. So thank you, Facebook, for shutting down America's greatest self-defense podcast and live show, and not letting people see the things they need to see. Maybe someday we'll have a technical solution to solve that. Mr. Rich Brown, how you doing, man?
I'm doing good, brother. Looking forward to the show. Like I said, not necessarily a happy topic, but one that hopefully can bring awareness to the topic for those of us that are out there. Where most people are engaged in their life. I mean, if I hadn't have been the regional manager for disaster preparedness for the Red Cross, maybe I wouldn't be so attuned to some of the things that are going on. But now we are, and we want to bring it to you in a way that is palatable and is shareable and scalable with people to learn about this topic, which is going to be global thermonuclear war. And then next week, as you alluded to, we're going to give you some preparedness tips on it.
Yeah, folks, we're going to talk about hard skills and soft skills and all those things that I would guess on the American Warrior Show and in some of our content. Of course, I'm in the Live Fire studio on Live Fire as well. We could talk about, having a rifle with an LVPO, and why the utility of that is important and why it might be critically important post-attack, post-EMP, post-nuclear war, or whatever else. Of course, we wouldn't have a show if we didn't have sponsors. We have multiple sponsors. You can check out our sponsors like Precision Holsters and all the different guys and gals that support us on AmericanWarriorShow.com. And by the way, if you're listening to this right now and you want to go to the show notes, we're going to offer a PDF download of some of the PowerPoints we're going to show. We're going to have a lot of links and a lot of resources. So this is a subject that you probably need to continue to read about and research. Of course, we're going to talk about the book itself. All of those details are in the show notes section of AmericanWarriorShow.com. Just go to show notes, and you can share this show as well. So we're really hoping this show gets to some folks and allows us to, get in front of people. So do me a favor, click share, let people know we're on. We got all of 15 live viewers on right now, Mr. Rich Brown, which is kind of odd. That's kind of a low number. We're live on 3 Facebook pages. American Warrior Society Shooting Performance, which has 70-some thousand followers. How's that for metrics, Rich Brown? 70-some thousand followers just for shooting performance alone. And I know I put an email out to thousands. I know IDPA put an announcement out, and we're live in front of 16 folks. Thank you once again, Facebook. Pee off.
What are you going to do, right?
Yeah, here we go.
Mike Rowan says, the more resources, the better. And that's one of the things, that was wading through the resources, wading through the data to try to make reasonable sense of it. So this is part one, Mike. And if you're ready, let's just jump into it.
Let's do it.
So the inspiration for this book is Mike has read a lot of nuclear books about this topic. I have read one or two, and again, I've talked to the experts on our show for the last 10 years. But there was something about the way that Annie Jacobsen in her book, Nuclear War, a Scenario, laid it out for me that made an emotional impact on the topic. What say you?
Well, the reality is, if you haven't read the book, you need to read the book. I knew the book was out, and Annie Jacobsen has written several great books. Area 51, Surprise, Kill, Vanish, which is about America's special ops and secret warriors that are doing all kinds of stuff. She wrote a book about the Pentagon's brain. She wrote a book about missing one or the other one. I think the German scientists that were recruited by the U.S. Yes. The bottom line is, and I knew that she was writing this book, Nuclear War, and certainly, folks, we don't know her. We're not promoting or supporting the book necessarily, but it's a fantastic book because the reality is, an author writes books to allow people to buy books and allow people to sell books. I mean, that's the bottom line. But the way she wrote this from a scenario standpoint is truly chilling. And the word you used on the podcast we did that said, hey, I ordered the book that day was terrifying. Yeah. And the downside is everything in the book is very well researched. She tends to be a very, very good researcher. And it's truly terrifying. And like Rich, we talked about in the pre-show, I've read Command and Control. I have some technical books on nuclear warfare and what happens when a nuke goes off. I know we've been talking about EMPs forever because that's the big things like, an EMP goes off, we all lose power, and then we starve or whatever else. The truth is, I would choose an EMP over a nuclear war tenfold. After reading this book. So it's a scary, scary thing, folks. We got 23 live viewers on right now. I love that. Good morning. Who do we have on, Mr. Rich Brown?
We got Dr. Gordon Botson up there. He is coin number 1688. And if you want to find out that becoming a coin member of our self-preservation community is the right decision, not only for you, but for your loved ones as well, then take a 14-day free test drive. Gerald Dees is on. Mr. Bill Armstrong, Simplify, sir. He says, here while I can. I got a day job. Mark over in Australia is on. Says, good morning, Mike and Rich. Kerry Grant is on. He is coin number 2515. So is Dave Garrett. Come on. So we talked about Annie Jacobsen and I will go ahead and plug her book. Please buy the book, read the book, share the book. It's great on Audible. Here's this is going to be the show today. We're going to talk about, is nuclear war impending? Let's get that out of the way up front. We're going to talk about Russia relative to the U.S. nuclear release doctrine. What does the doctrine actually say when they will or will not release nuclear weapons? Nuclear stockpiles. Let's take a look. I mean, are we talking about one weapon or two weapons or hundreds of thousands of weapons? What are these things? Tactical nukes versus strategic nukes. We're going to explain the U.S. nuclear triad. What is the three legs of the nuclear triad? We're going to talk about MIRVs, which is something I had never heard about until I had Annie Jacobsen until I read her book, which is odd because I spoke to a lot of these people. None of them ever mentioned the terror that is a MIRV. We're going to talk about nuclear yields, just how horrific the yield is and what is the yield. We're going to talk about the largest bomb that's ever been dropped, which is the Tsar Bomba, which is the Tsar bomb. And then finally, nuclear holocaust and nuclear winter. And that'll kind of close out part one. Anything to add on to that, Mike?
No, man, let's jump into it. And folks, we will have a bunch of references in the show notes pages. Like I said, before I read her book, I read Command and Control that talks about this, and I'll maybe briefly talk about it in this show, the Strategic Air Command, and how we literally had bombers with nuclear weapons in the air 24 hours a day for many, many, many years. And actually some of the accidental things that happened in the Cold War that is absolutely chilling. By the way, we'll mention some of those things, but let's jump into the details, man.
So as of January the 23rd, 2024, the doomsday clock is set to 90 seconds to midnight. It's the closest it's ever been in the 77-year history. So what is the doomsday clock? It's the thing that tells us how close humanity is to destroying itself. And there's a board of PhDs and Nobel laureates that comprise the cadre, I guess, lack of a better word, or the senior fellows at the Doomsday Clock Institute. And they publish a paper that says this is why we said it here. And it's terrifying that we've never been this close. Even the Cuban Missile Crisis, we weren't as close as we are now.
Man, I think if you're listening to this subject and are like me, maybe you're a 40, 50-year-old, 30-year-old, whatever age you are, maybe older, and you went through a portion of the Cold War, and then later on in life you learned a lot of things about the Cold War that you didn't realize. I'm going to be honest, Rich, until we discussed this subject at length, I had no idea how possible the potential is. We're not trying to be fear mongers either. If you're listening to this on the podcast version or watching the video later on, we're not trying to be fear mongers. We're just reciting information that both come from the book and then come from our independent research. And that's something I think that every American needs to be aware of. Or maybe, who knows, whoever else is listening to this, maybe you happen to be someone somewhere that influences nuclear policy and can maybe talk to someone in the right manner that will say, hey, what is the deal here? Politicians, you've got us to the point where we're on this beautiful planet that has lots of resources, and with one mistake, most of us are dead.
Yeah, and that's what Guile is saying. And I think there's a quote, and I'm going to butcher it, but I'll just give you the paraphrase version. That is, at some point, the living will envy the dead. And that's a terrifying thing. So the risk of nuclear war has increased dramatically in the last 2 years since the United States and Russia, since Russia invaded Ukraine. And at that point, Russia and the United States both seem to have abandoned a lot of the long-standing nuclear arms control agreements. And the United States has started to develop more tactical nuclear weapons. We'll talk about maybe later that the U.S. has, I think, roughly 200 tactical nukes to Russia's in excess of 2,000. We'll talk about what a tactical nuke is in a minute. That's something you should be concerned about or not. But there now, the United States is developing more tactical nuclear weapons. And that, of course, is from some Princeton researchers. So we are getting closer. Now, is it impending? Well, let's give you a couple of pieces of anecdotal information here, Mike. On 6 May 2024, Vladimir Putin announced he had authorized the deployment of tactical nuclear weapons in southern Russia. He claimed that there was no, quote, nothing unusual in such a planned training exercise. However, this is the first time that has been done since the fall of the Soviet Union. Additionally, the movement also involved the transfer of some tactical nuclear weapons to Belarus. That's never been done before. So everybody's positioning their stuff, and the United States has positioned their tactical nuclear weapons to NATO, and we have moved them back to Britain for the first time in 20 or 30 years. So it looks like both sides of this geopolitical chessboard are moving their pieces toward the center, and that's concerning.
Yeah, man. It seems like all of these chess pieces are being moved in different manners. And let's just, Rich, let's just say that, with this doomsday clock, that there's some strategy to this, right? Some strategic chess pieces being moved around. I don't think that's my biggest fear. I think my biggest fear is some of the accidental issues that could possibly go on. And I know we're going to talk about that, but folks, if you're not hearing what we're calling out, this doomsday clock is, a pretty legitimate potential predictor of the possibility of nuclear war. If you think about what we just covered, and this is something I didn't realize, this is something that kind of woke me up. And I'm not going to tell you that Mike Seeklander has a solution for this. I think there's some preparation steps we're going to talk about in part 2 that maybe you can embrace. But the bottom line is I really never had an idea of the potential risk of this right now. So at a minimum, if you're listening or watching later on, communicate this to your family members, share this show, talk to your politicians, influence people, because as a human species living on this planet, the fact that we are potentially very, very close to destroying all life as we know it, and all forms or ways of life as we know it in the two global continents right now is ridiculous. And I know, maybe at some point in time there might be a retired pilot from the Strategic Air Command, or someone that manned a missile bunker, that was working through the Cold War, that was, dedicated to keeping the U.S. safe. Well, I would propose that massive mutual destruction is not necessarily keeping us safe. So how are two government entities and the politicians and folks making the decisions came to this point or got us to this point is kind of ridiculous. My personal opinion is, we missed something along the way. I know back in the day, and we'll talk about the buildup of nuclear weapons, which was unfathomable if you realize how many we actually had, to, the drawdown, or maybe there was some communication between Reagan and, Gorbachev, and the wall came down, and all these things that were really, really great. And now we're back in 2024, Rich, a time when technology is as good as it's ever been. The time when we have the technology and the resources to potentially live on a planet and actually start to protect the planet, where we are preemptively set up to literally destroy it. And those that made some of these decisions along the way, and some of the current decisions and policies in place, should be ashamed of themselves. That's the bottom line.
Yeah, we'll talk about some of the policy stuff and the SALT treaties that brought this nuclear stockpiles from 70,000 down to a more reasonable stockpile, if there is such thing. Bill Armstrong says, at this point, I am less concerned to some degree about full-scale nuclear war than small-form nukes that are deniable or can be blamed on a terrorist group. Yeah, and we will talk about that, because I share that fear as well. Robert is on. Johnny King is on. Says time to get an old school desk to get under. John Rena is on. Good morning, sir. Oscar is on. Sophia said excited for this. So recently, as in May the 9th, the foreign minister, Russian's deputy foreign minister, Sergei whomever, told reporters, quote, the doctrine and basics of state policy in the area of nuclear deterrence explicitly states the possibilities for the first use of nuclear weapons. That is, first strike option is on the table. Now, I was reading after I prepared this show, Mike, that I believe it was 2 years ago, the Ukrainian forces were pushing through the Russian lines. They had breached them, and they were moving on the Crimea, some of the things that Russia had already captured in 2014. And it was looking like this breakthrough they were going to be able to roll back everything and even gain the territory back that they had lost 10 years ago. And at that point, one of Russia's senior generals made a couple of phone calls, one to Secretary Austin and a few other NATO generals, said, look, we are about to launch tactical nukes. You better get them back. So in that moment, there was a lot of diplomatic back channeling, like, hey, man, we're going to rein in Ukraine. Don't do it. But that speaks to what Bill Armstrong was just saying. I'm going to pop a tactical nuke on and kill 20,000 of these Ukrainians. You're not taking this territory. And that's terrifying. Now, what happens when that first domino falls is anybody's guess. But you and I remember from the book, Mike, she talked about these scenarios have been played out by RAND and the Brookings Institute and a whole lot of other companies that run the models. And what did they find, Mike? Every single time happened.
So the bottom line is, every single time, whatever the tipping point was, it ended in basically global thermonuclear warfare. And here's the thing, like, if Russia uses some tactical nukes at a smaller scale level, and someone in that arena responds with something the same, or the U.S. strategically decides to do A, B, or C, man, I mean, let me say this very clearly. Once you read the book, I'm not sure if this is the right way to say this, Rich, and tell me if you disagree. I would certainly embrace a couple tactical nukes, or even a full-scale random weird attack nuke, versus the heightened strategic response by two major countries that are trying to respond before they're destroyed, which is typically what the book breaks down. I mean, I know that sounds horrible, like one or two tactical nukes or the use of one or two, but when you really think about, and I'll shed some light on the book, when you really think about the end portion where there's a bunch of ICBMs, like hundreds of them headed our way that can't be stopped, I think I'd prefer one. I know that sounds crazy, but at least maybe then it stops. Maybe then, hundreds of thousands or whatever. It's horrific. It's really bad. But we say, whoa, 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 whoa. We really just screwed up really badly. Someone screwed up, and they're going to pay, and maybe whatever that happens. But Rich, the alternative is everyone's dead.
Well, and that's the thing, right? I mean, deterrence only works if mutually assured destruction, escalation dominance, all this game theory that underpins our nuclear doctrine only works if everybody understands. All the players at the table know you launch one, it's Armageddon. So you want to do that, but again, I think there's something else at play here, and that's these interconnected alliances. We have nuclear war alliances with 30, I believe it's 28 or 30 different countries. Think about that. So we're entangled with all these countries that says we're going to release, and now here's the thing about the Ukraine. They're not under that umbrella. They may be at some point. I mean, hell, and this is one of those red lines that we're about to cross potentially, and we don't even know it yet. And that is, we're going to give, I think, in excess of 30 NATO countries are going to give in excess of 30 F-16 fighters. We're giving depleted uranium rounds in Russia's position. Like, you're about to use depleted uranium rounds on our troops, American-made depleted uranium. That may be a red line for them. But I would argue, too, when it comes to these entangled alliances, who would have guessed that some obscure 20-something-year-old radical, Gabrielo Princip, probably the most important man of the 20th century, and somebody that most of the people here in our voice this morning think of the 36 listening, I've probably never heard of Gabrielo Princip. Who the hell is this guy? How are you telling me he's more important than JFK or Martin Luther King Jr. to the 20th century? Because it was him that shot Archduke Ferdinand. And because of the entangled European alliances, we got World War I. And because we got World War I, we had this other thing called World War II. Because we had that, we had the Cold War. So it set off everything. And that's what scares me about, we're going to let them pop one tactical nuke. We have to say no.
Yeah, I agree, man. It's a scary concept. And folks, if you're joining us, welcome to the show. We're talking about nuclear war, kind of a unique live show as well as a podcast if you're listening later on. Someone asked the question, what book? Well, we referred to the book initially in the show. It's Annie Jacobsen's new book, Nuclear War. We will have show note links to all of these resources at the end of the show. Do me a favor, folks, the 37 people watching this right now, give a share, give a like, send a text message, make a phone call, send an email, try to bring people on the show, tell them to come to the IDPA, the American Warrior Study, or the Shooting Performance Facebook pages. We are live on all three. Rich, let's jump into some of the more details or some of the gruesome details of nuclear war.
Yeah, this is another scary thing that Putin said in March of this year. He said, quote, weapons exist in order to use them. He was being questioned about the Russian nuclear stockpile. And then he bragged that the Russia's nuclear triad is far more advanced than that of the United States. And of course, I think most people would disagree with that. When Putin was asked if nuclear confrontation with the West over Ukraine was inevitable, he said, quote, I don't think everything is rushing directly towards this, but we are ready. And then he went on to stress, I have said many times that Ukraine is a matter of life or death for us. So does that mean that the loss of Ukraine would be an existential threat to the survival of Russia? And the reason I postulate that, Mike, is because here, if you're watching us, thank you to the 40 folks. If you're watching, you can see this is Russia's nuclear release doctrine. If Russia's attacked with nuclear missiles, they will attack back. Number two, if they believe that their nuclear missiles are being launched against it, they will attack immediately. If the attack is aimed at crippling its nuclear forces, it releases. Then number four is the very existence of the Russian state is threatened. And this is included in the doctrine, including the use of superior conventional weapons by NATO. Guys, this is what I'm talking about right here, Mike.
Yeah, man. And one of the things that we're talking about is Russia, Ukraine. I know someone in the show has already mentioned China. To be honest with you, China's kind of scary, but I think China is very tied to our economy. What's really, really, really scary is the crazy man over in North Korea that does have nukes. That this actually the scenario in the book, and I don't want to spill too much of the book. I want people to buy it and read it as well. Certainly, the North Korea has an influence over what happens in the book in a very, very large way. I don't know if I would say that Russia has any logic. I think they think completely different. I think we see things from our side of the coin. Certainly, they probably see things from their side of the coin. The evidence of that was the dead man's hand back in the day, and I don't know if that still exists. If it does, Rich, are you going to talk about that in the PowerPoint?
No, I'm not, because again, I don't know that may be outdated at this point.
Yeah, so just to understand the way they thought back in the day during the Cold War, Russia had built a system called the dead man's hand, and the bottom line was the dead man's hand was a combination of, I believe, temperature and probably seismic sensors, where if these sensors and all of these different facets of intelligence detected that there was a nuclear attack on Russia. Maybe it was back in the day. I think they actually believed that U.S. would do a preemptive nuclear attack. But if the evidence was there that there was a preemptive nuclear attack and all of Russia's infrastructure, all of their command and control was then destroyed, this dead man's hand would go into automated mode. This is almost unbelievable to think about this, the fact that this existed. It would go into automated mode and launch all pre-targeted ICBMs. So all ICBMs in Russia under this dead man's hand control would launch. Regardless of what happens, this is a mechanical device set up to launch everything they have. And by the way, if you're listening or watching right now, if you don't know anything about ICBMs, once they're launched, they can't be recalled, or at least not with the technology that I know of that we have that's unclassified. They can't be stopped. They can't be turned off. They can't be controlled. They have 3 phases of boost. I don't know if Rich is going to cover that in his PowerPoint here in a second. But the bottom line is, once they're targeted, they are on the way. They're going to enter the atmosphere on stage 3, and they're going to explode wherever they hit. And Russia's dead man's hand was going to launch everything they had in a counter response, even if they're all dead. Think about that.
That's so damn chilly.
Think about that.
Yeah,
we're gonna.
It wouldn't be hard to do either. All you'd have to, my son is a coder. He could code this play in an afternoon. Like, look, if communication lines are no longer coming to the missile silo, something's been cut. I'm reading seismic data that's telling me all indicators are that radioactives have been released. Seismic things are sensing it. Therefore, ergo hoc propter hoc, shoot them.
Exactly. Well, and we'll talk about this. Maybe we'll go faster on these areas of the slides. There, as you know, Rich, there are another thing people don't realize is that there have been several major incidents where we detected a nuclear attack and made a lucky, maybe a God-blessed decision not to launch a counterattack. Russia had the same thing happen at least 2 or 3 times in history, where we detected a full-scale launch, where they detected a full-scale launch. In one of the cases, it was actually the luminescent moon rising over the horizon that was detected by this radar that converted it to 100 and some ballistic missiles that were inbound, right? So we have had these systems, these mechanical devices that thankfully didn't give us the information that we needed. And there was a human in the link that said, I don't think this is correct. In that case, Khrushchev or whatever was in DC or something for some sort of conference. And a human said, I'm not going to launch a counterattack. And the same thing happened with Russia, right? So we're literally one decision away from having existed right now. If those decisions had went the other way, this podcast wouldn't exist. I wouldn't be speaking to you. You wouldn't be listening to me. None of this would exist. It's all gone. It's all destroyed.
Yeah, that's the thing. The speed with which, and Annie Jacobsen talks a lot about this in the book, and this is something I didn't know, was the speed at which these decisions have to be made. You talk about the Boyd's decision cycle, the OODA loop, and all this other stuff. You got 6 minutes and the clock's ticking. If you want to get I think the nuclear warfare strategy is kind of very simplistic, chillingly so. Use them or lose them, because if the silos are fixing it smacked, you got 6 minutes if you want to get those missiles out. and headed toward their targets. So this is the most recent that I could find U.S. nuclear war doctrine. And here it is. I'll read it for you for those that are listening. As long as nuclear weapons exist, the fundamental role of the U.S. nuclear weapons is to deter nuclear attack on the United States, our allies, and partners. The U.S. would only consider the use of nuclear weapons in extreme circumstances to defend the vital interests of the United States. And this is the important part. Listen, guys, or its allies and partners. Now, you remember we just read the Russian nuclear warfare doctrine does not say anything about allies and partners, but the U.S. explicitly does. Am I making more of that than I probably should, Mike?
I don't know, man. Honestly, and I'm going to be honest, folks. When you're listening to this, or those that are watching us live right now, I think that a lot of you are probably. I think a lot of us are filled with opinions. We have opinions about Ukraine. We have opinions about assisting Ukraine or not assisting Ukraine. Some of us maybe are open-minded enough to understand some of Russia's perspective on Ukraine. I have family members that are Ukrainian that hate Russia, that their family members in their country was attacked by Russia. But there is more to this thing at stake than just one country. When you really think about the aspect of us destroying the planet we live on and all of our resources and the ozone and plants, literally destroying the planet we are living on. We only have one planet. There's nowhere we can go. Those that are in a bunker somewhere that may come out of their bunker a week or months later will not come out to a normal planet. I think maybe we should. I think maybe we got to be careful with some of our political opinions, and remind ourselves that we're human, and that as humans we should all. I think we would all, if we were hanging out right now, Rich, with with a bunch of Russians, and we're like, hey, we're going to kill you all, and you're going to kill us all. Maybe we should just have a drink of bourbon or vodka instead. Yeah. Think about this. Think about the concept of this. It's utterly ridiculous. And I'm not saying we shouldn't be nuclear armed or we didn't have to do some of those things, because I think had we sat back after the technology existed and we pursued it, which you could go back and analyze and look at how the secrets got leaked and that whole program or process. Russia has a very good intelligence network, right? We have a very good intelligence network, but the bottom line is, should we have done the things we've done? Should we have built the things we've built? Or at some point in time, should someone say, you're all going to die and we're all going to die? And if nothing else, maybe that should bring us to the table. And maybe this podcast will get to some Russian camped out in the U.S. that is collecting intel right now, and you speak good English and you'll listen to this and realize, yeah, maybe these guys make some sense. Maybe we should talk to someone about this and start getting people all at one table. Maybe. Am I ridiculous? How about me? Am I being ridiculous hoping for that?
No, but at some level, there's human nature involved, especially this thing we always have as far as othering. We always, this is my camp and your camp and their camp, and then when you ratchet it up to scale, it has terrifying consequences. There's a lot of amazing comments here. Thinking of the 40 folks watching us, but I just want to say we got folks watching that worked in Pershing missile silos. They're making comments. If we get anything wrong, guys, please let us know. Neither Mike nor I, we're a couple of self-defense guys, shooters, Marines, cops. Nuclear warfare is outside my lane, although I've had the good virtue of talking to some folks that know about this stuff. And of course, we've done a little bit of reading. But let's take a look at the nuclear stockpile, Mike. For every red dot you see, there are 20 nuclear weapons. So if you look at Russia relative to NATO, they're pretty evenly matched. Russia has, as far as we know, 5,977. The U.S. and its NATO partners have 5,943. But then look at China, 350. Look at Pakistan, 165. India, 160. Israel, 90. And of course, North Korea, the new player on the stage, has 20 that we know of. So, and again, that's why I wanted to make sure you understand the entangled alliances. And another thing is, look at the Pakistan-India situation. We make a lot of China and Taiwan and Russia and the Ukraine and NATO and all this stuff, but those two guys could start shooting at each other. And I don't know what our alliance doctrine is for India or China. What would we do if they just started throwing nukes back and forth?
I don't know. And folks, as we continue through the PowerPoint, what we will do is, for those that are listening and are wondering what the dots we're talking about, we will export this as a PDF or something like that and add the show notes. So you can get a copy of the PDF we're going to create. Just go to AmericanWarriorShow.com once the show is done and we've released it, and go to the show notes for this particular show, and any documents we've referenced, we'll have a download to it.
And I thought when I put the one with the dots on there, I'm like, okay, that's interesting. But let's look at it relative to the map. Where are these nukes really at? And as you look at this, you see that a lot of these nuclear-armed countries bump up against other countries that maybe they're not so friendly with. And then it starts looking a little bit different. So this is just one more data point. But Mike, you alluded to something earlier in the show. You talked about how nuclear proliferation just went bananas. And as you can see here on this chart, we start from 1945, where there might be one. The Manhattan Project is going on. Bang, we drop one on Hiroshima. We drop one on Nagasaki. Then there's a third that Oppenheimer's like, hey, I've got enough material. We can make one more if you need another one. And I think Truman rightly said, no, we're going to make a tactical pause, give them an opportunity to surrender. And they did. But then it just exploded, right? Once Russia had theirs, and at one point we had an excess of 70,000 nuclear weapons. And then Reagan, someone mentioned the TV show, the made-for-TV show, the day after. Mm. And as I understand, the mythology around this is Reagan had a screening of that show and decided to do something about it. And there was some talks and arms reduction treaties, and we finally got down to where we are today from a height of 70,000. Isn't that crazy?
It's insane. And it's also insane that Reagan did something about it, through whatever political channels, and they certainly downsized exponentially. I'm not certain if it was fair and open, but in theory, it was fair and open, where they had the ability to inspect us and we had the ability to inspect them. And we had this movement. We moved forward, right? We realized, hey, we like this planet. We don't have another planet to go to. Maybe we shouldn't destroy the planet. And now we have gone the opposite direction. What have our politicians been doing ever since, on both sides of the party, by the way? I'm not labeling Democratic or Republican or Independent. I'm saying on both sides of the party, other than focusing on themselves and votes. What have they done to truly lead and communicate? Right? I know what the U.S. military has done. The U.S. military has done what it's paid to do. It has done what it thinks its mission is, which is to be prepared to defend or attack the U.S. of America. Right? I get that. Right. So I don't poo-poo on, the guys out there in a submarine right now that have more nuclear firepower than you could possibly imagine. They're incredibly scary. I don't poo-poo on any of that. I get why they're doing that, because they know what the other side is doing. But I find myself so irritated, Rich, by the fact that since Reagan, every single politician, every U.S. president hasn't made not destroying the freaking planet one of their biggest goals. Why not? Explain that to me, right?
Yeah, I can't.
I would welcome anybody to explain that. Write me an email. Tell me why. What were you focusing on, Mr. President?
Yeah, Mike at shooting-performance.com. Brian says, are you disregarding the fact that the nuclear bombing of Japan would never have occurred but for the Navy and uncountable support of personnel? No, I mean, it was the USS Indianapolis, as I understand it, that carried those materials over to make the bomb so they could be launched. So, and of course, the Indianapolis was sunk by a Japanese sub, and we lost almost 800 sailors. So now everybody in that time had a role to play. When we talk about nuclear stockpiles, it's important to understand that we're not talking about one size fits all nuclear weapons. We're talking about strategic nukes as well as tactical nukes. So this is just a graph. If you're listening, you can't see the graph, but we're going to talk about it more in detail. I just want you to understand that it's not one size fits all. So let's break this down. Tactical nukes relative to strategic nuclear weapons. Tactical nuclear weapons are small nukes and delivery systems meant to carry out a limited strike in a smaller area. On the other hand, strategic nuclear weapons are understood to mean causing greater large scale. They're city destroying machines. Tactical nuclear weapons have a relatively short range and much lower yield than a strategic nuclear weapon, which again are capable of destroying entire cities, which is just absolutely chilling. And this speaks to, before I go much further, man, this speaks to one of the concerns that one of the listeners and viewers this morning had. I envision a scenario like this, and this is something we've talked about on the show, where Putin needs a rail taken out or a bridge taken out or some tactical advance like we talked about almost happened 2 years ago. I need to stop. I got to stop this dead in its tracks. Bang, I'm going to set this off. Now you can play denial for a while because we have the Moab, the mother of all bombs. We have a Blue 82. These are the largest conventional devices we have. They're enormous. And for a while you can play stupid, like, I just popped one of those, until German seismic sensors and some other, in Finland and Sweden, they're going to detect the radioactive fallout. They're going to trace it back to Russia. It's going to take weeks or months before we sort it out and go, yeah, you did, in fact, use a nuke. Meanwhile, they're playing diplomatic. No, I didn't. But then what do you do? Because you've had a cooling off period, right, Mike? You've had an opportunity to go, do I really want to retaliate with nukes? It taken me months to figure out that it was one. Yeah, okay, 4,000, 5,000 people were killed on that day in that event. But what do we do at that point,
I don't know.
I don't either.
I don't know.
And I don't think nobody's talking about that scenario, but that's the one that worries me, because now the genie's out of the bottle.
Yeah. And I don't know, Rich.
I don't either. And if you do have Rich at AmericanWarriorCenter.com, I'd love to hear your thoughts. But that's the scenario that kind of, we get it. If it, like in Annie Jacobsen's book, North Korea fires a nuke, it's coming. Everybody knows it, and we have to respond to it. But in this case, the UN would do a lot of hand wringing and scolding, but at the same time, do we let him get away with it? What does that look like? I don't know. Is it regime change in Russia time? I mean, you got me, guys. So let's look at our nuclear triad, Mike, because this is interesting. It's 3 legs, and it's an air leg, a ground leg, and a sea leg. The air leg is nuclear capable heavy bombers that carry gravity bombs or cruise missiles. The ground leg are intercontinental ballistic missiles that are in silos ready to launch. And of course, you got the sea leg, ballistic missile submarines that carry ballistic missiles. Now we're going to break down each one because this is fascinating to me. And this graph I think is awesome. The air leg, I didn't know this, Mike. We have 20 B-2 stealth bombers, 20 of those things, 46 B-52s that have been around probably since the 50s, a lot of them. But like you said, Mike, back in the day, these things, especially the B-52s, the Strategic Air Command had those things in the air 24/7, probably flying around the pole region and just waiting. And they're carrying nuclear bombs at that time. Now, as I understand it, and I could be wrong, you tell me, we don't have that anymore. Those bombers are not up there right now.
Yeah, correct. I think from what I understand, that we don't have a 24-hour-a-day Strategic Air Command, system in place where we literally have nuclear armed airplanes flying all the time. Back in the day, we did. I think there was a point where they had nuclear armed airplanes on the tarmac, and they had a certain protocol where if, the klaxons went off, the horns went off, and we had some sort of impending attack, that they would get in the airplanes and launch. But the problem was, it's Rich, when you break it down, and one of the things that she does great in this book, and there's some other books out there, I think it's the one that I was referring to as Command and Control. It's all about timing. Like it's about the amount of time you have to potentially respond to a nuclear attack. So everything is broken down, to an extent, minutes and seconds. How fast can we possibly respond? And by the way, and we haven't really talked about this, and she doesn't really talk about this a ton in her book, but some of the newer weapon systems, the hypersonic missiles, will completely change that. But if you think about those 3 things, the nuclear triad, back in the day, we had nothing but, mainly nuclear bombers. And then eventually, the ICBM technology grew to the point where, we could have all of these ICBMs that are hidden in the ground all over Wyoming and North Dakota and Montana or whatever else. Back in the day, SAC, the Strategic Air Command, was opposed to ICBMs, of course, because they got a piece of their pie. It's so funny, even in our political or our major military commands, the Army is always arguing with the Air Force, and the Air Force is arguing with the Navy on, hey, we get more nukes, or you get more nukes, or we should be in charge of the nukes, and whatever else. Just so
it's
we
the othering that we were talking about, right?
It is. It's always the othering. But the interesting thing, and if you haven't read that book or done that research, you should, because you will also become aware or educated on the potential accidents we've had. So back in the day, there were not as many fail safes on most of the nuclear weapons. So, for example, there was at least one case of a nuclear warhead that was dropped from an airplane that had lightning damage or something to that effect. And during its fall to the earth, when this airplane caught on fire, I think 6 of the 7 fail safes on the nuclear warhead failed. And one of them, matter of fact, it was the one that they had instilled or installed, based on some of their political decisions, maybe in the years just before that, stopped it from going off. I think it landed in, maybe it was South Carolina, Rich, if I'm wrong. And that was not a kilotonnage nuke, if I remember correctly. It was a megatonnage nuke.
Yeah.
Megaton. That's 1,000,000 tons of TNT. 1 megaton is 1,000,000 tons. Imagine a ton, 1 ton of TNT, 2,000 pounds of TNT. 1 pound, Rich, of TNT would lift your car off the ground, right?
Well, yeah, I used to teach demo at the School of Infantry, man, and we used to do the demonstration we would do is we would take a 50 caliber ammo can, a little bit of deck cord, and a non-electrical blasting cap, and just set it off. And the students would see, it would take that 50 caliber can and turn it inside out and throw it, 100 yards into the sky, just a tiny little blasting cap. So what we're talking about is almost unimaginable, but just to try to put your head around it, I've got some links to this thing called Nuke Map. It's going to blow your mind. I've got some scenarios and stuff we'll talk about later in the show. But relative to the triad, man, that's just the air leg. 20 B-2 stealth bombers, 46 B-52s pre-positioned around the world. And then the land leg, of course, the silos we talked about, 450 intercontinental ballistic missile launch facilities and 400 deployed Minuteman III ICBMs. Now, this is all controlled by the Nuclear Command and Control and Communications Center. And the information you're getting now is from the Government Accounting Office. The sea leg, this is the scariest one, right? Because they could be anywhere. They're undetectable. And that's 240 submarine launch ballistic missiles deployed on Ohio class ballistic submarines. I mean, and I've got just some visuals here so you can see what I'm talking about when I say B-52s and B-2 bombers. The ground leg, I want to go into this just a smidge more because this is where the bulk of our arsenal is. And when you think of, there's ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles, and there's also medium range ballistic missiles. And the medium range can go anywhere from 620 miles to about 1,800 miles. So they're stuck within that range. But an ICBM is for ranges greater than 3,400 miles, meaning anywhere on the globe it can hit. These delivery vehicles are powered by, like Mike alluded to earlier, liquid or solid fueled rocket that are primarily, once they reach their max ordinate, they begin free fall mode and gravity takes over and they're just coming in. An ICBM can reach targets around the globe in 30 minutes after launch. It's important to understand, and this is something Mike alluded to earlier, and this is one of those, man, I had no idea. But once the president authorizes the launch of any of these nuclear armed missiles, they cannot be recalled or destroyed in flight. And the same is true of the ones that are launched from a submarine. Once they come out of the water, it's over. Now, this is where the air leg probably it has a bit more of importance because we can recall the bombers. We can load up the bombers and have them start moving that way, maybe as more of a deterrent. Once Russia picks up that here's a fleet of B-2s and B-52s coming, maybe they can tone it down. But once those B-2s and B-52s launch their payloads, they are also unrecoverable.
One of the things that I'm not certain if I am correct about this, Rich, but the ICBMs, when we talk about the listener right now, if you're listening, you may say, well, why don't we have a kill switch? That doesn't make any sense. With our technology and communication ability and whatever else, you would think we could launch an ICBM and we could detonate it over the ocean, right? Oh, let's do a command detonation. Russia called us and everything's okay, so why not? And I don't know if that's a technology issue, but what I believe I've read, and if I understand it correctly, is if we had a method of a technology or a signal method of command detonating or stopping an ICBM, then of course our enemies would use that to stop an ICBM. They would become useless. So it is quite scary. Of course, with a submarine, you could potentially launch a signal that may stop the attack before they actually launch. With an airplane, that's a great thing. You can recall these airplanes and say, hey, guys, stop. We're not going to attack them. But man, once they launch from a bunker, or once we launch from a bunker, that's the thing I think I fear the most. And it's like, is it possible one of these things could preemptively launch? I believe there's so many fail safes. Likely not, Rich. But what mechanical device do we know of that has ever had a perfect record? I mean, we had a silo near me here in Arkansas that didn't go nuclear, didn't yield, but it blew up and killed a bunch of people and contaminated a big area. So um,
that was the one where they were repairing the silo and they dropped the nut.
That's right. They dropped the nut and then it started spewing the gas because everything about the silos, everything about those things is toxic. The fuel inside is toxic. The oxidizers, highly toxic, crazy scary. These things are unbelievably designed, but they're also very fragile in their design. So the concept that someone couldn't go nutty and launch something, or maybe Russia's dead man's hand switch goes nutty one day and launches one, and we detect one from somewhere that we think is okay now, and that's what the book breaks down.
That's what Skynet. I mean, that goes all the way back to 1980 or War Games, those movies from our childhood. Let's talk about the sea leg, man. Because these submarines that are out there patrolling 24/7 are terrifying. We got 18 Ohio-class submarines. Nuclear missiles launched from ships or submarines. They are classified under an umbrella of vessels and submarines that are capable of launching. 14 of those are ballistic missiles, and then we have 4 that are guided missile submarines. And this is just take a look at what the inside of a nuclear-powered submarine is like. They make their own oxygen. They make their own water. They can stay underwater. They can cruise underneath the poles at will. I mean, these things are terrifying. There could be a Soviet one sitting right now in the Potomac and, several hundred yards away from the White House. And I don't think we would know it, or maybe we would. I don't know. But this is scary.
Yeah, literally, folks. If you think about all of the things we're talking about, an airplane can be launched and recalled. In ICBM, the second tier of the triad, maybe that's the second resort that the U.S. president decides to use or whatever else. Obviously, the thing about submarines and the way that it's described in the book and other books I've read is these are the most terrifying aspect of nuclear war, mainly because of where they could be, whether it's off the coast of California or off the coast of, Washington, D.C. It's highly likely there are potential Chinese, maybe not nuclear, North Korean nuclear subs, our subs, certainly Russian subs that are so close where if we have an ICBM launch and we detect it, we have about 30-ish minutes or so to respond. And by the way, Rich, we talked about this too. I talked to my buddies. We're game planning our little, what do we do if right now our phones go off and the whatever signal goes, hey, we're under a nuclear attack, prepare for nuclear attack. I'm assuming we're going to get a warning of some sort as Americans, assuming they don't hit us with an EMP first. But
you ain't getting a warning.
But the warning is if you do get any kind of a warning that they put out on a phone, or maybe someone, you get a text message, it's likely not that 30-minute window. It's likely 15 to 20 minutes inside of that window where we're trying to detect and trying to triangulate and trying to calculate. And I don't think we'll get a warning either. But even if you had a perfect situation where, like, I got on a text message list that is in this government entity that is going to send me a warning, okay, maybe you have 10 minutes to respond. But with a nuclear sub, man, you live on the eastern seaboard, good luck. We're talking minutes. Yeah. Same thing with the West Coast.
I'm looking at the FEMA documents, Mike, because I'm preparing for next week's show, and there's a 2-page FEMA document it's infographic kind of thing, and and I think it says expect no warning, but if you do get one, you won't have very long to prepare.
So that's the warning is going to be a flash, which, by the way, don't look at.
Well, don't look. I think it's more likely that there'll be reports that silo doors are blowing off, and somebody's cell phone will cover some missiles going out on our behalf. That might be it. And I'm like, what the hell is this? Is this real on TikTok? And by the time you figure out that this is in fact real and the news are reporting it, there'll be flashes popping up all over the United States. That's just my thoughts on that. Let's go back to the MERV, man, because this is one of those things, multiple independently targetable re-entry vehicles. So if you look, I have a picture here of what a MERV looks like. So each one of those cones, it's like an upside down sugar cone, ice cream cone, is its own targetable thermonuclear weapon. So as the ICBM goes up, at some point during its re-entry phase, the top of the cone comes off, and each one of the targetable MERVs takes off to its own location. Some of these are reported to carry up to 16 MERV warheads on the re-entry vehicles, and they can travel at different speeds and head in different directions. And each MERV can hit a target roughly 1,000 miles away from each other. So this is terrifying. Okay, we're just tracking one inbound. Okay, well, that one inbound could be 16 megaton MERVs that's going to annihilate 16 U.S. cities. Just that one rocket. That's something I really didn't know about.
Yeah, actually, the interesting thing was, and I don't know if it's the Minutemen or that had the first MERV kind of system or design, but when I actually toured a nuclear command bunker that's, I guess it would be slightly north of Cheyenne. It's just along the interstate. And by the way, I had been driving by this thing for years, Rich, and had no idea there was anything there. And then all of a sudden, one day, there was a sign that says, "Hey, retired nuclear bunker, Minuteman bunker, or whatever, come visit it." You can go literally take a tour of this thing and get down inside of it. But the lady that led the tour, I think she actually worked in the program back in the day. I'm not certain, but she was so proud of this. Of course, the guidance system that's on the missile itself. There's actually one of the guidance devices on the system itself that is $1 million or whatever it is, and had this very complex gadgetry. But one of her other proud declarations was that we went from a single warhead on an ICBM to these MERVs, or multiple warheads on an ICBM, which apparently was even more of a deterrent for Russia. Of course, they eventually got the technology and have the ability to do the same thing. I'm not certain if their targeting is as good as ours, but it's incredibly scary, which is also why, by the way, folks, if you're like, well, they launched nukes, as far as we know, we could probably shoot them down with what? Back in the day, it was a Star Wars system where Reagan was trying to develop. Now there's really no chance that we can destroy the ICBMs that are inbound if they launch ICBMs, especially with the MERVs. So if they're inbound, there's just one thing that's going to happen: they're going to explode.
Yeah. And that Annie Jacobsen goes into that in her book. Obviously, she talks about, we have, I think there's 40 or 50 of these that are designed to shoot down incoming ICBMs. However, they have like a 50% effectiveness ratio. So at best case, they're going to shoot down half of them. And we only have 40. And I think some of them are in Alaska, some of them are on the West Coast. That is, if any of this is true, because I'm sure it's classified, but don't count on those to do much of anything. So let's talk about yield, man. This right here, if you could see the infographic I put up for you, we're talking about major nuclear detonations. And all the way to the right, you can see the small nuclear weapons that were dropped on Japan, 15 kilotons, all the way up to the giant gray 50,000 kiloton warhead that was the Tsar Bomba. And then this is one of those most chilling facts that came out of the book for me in doing the research and preparation for the show. And that is that during the period of the peak energy output, a 1 megaton nuclear weapon can produce temperatures of about 100 million degrees Celsius at the center, which is about 4 to 5 times that at which occurs at the center of our sun. This is unimaginable heat that's going to incinerate things for miles. And I'll give you some anecdotes here in just a second, because I want to dive into the Tsar bomb, which is the largest device ever detonated. Its yield was 50 megatons, or 5,000 kilotons, which is equal to 3,800 of the bombs we dropped on Hiroshima. Let me say that again, because maybe you didn't hear that. You're driving, you're not paying attention. That one bomb was equal to 3,800 bombs like we dropped on Hiroshima. The mushroom cloud climbed 40 miles into the sky. Third-degree burns were possible at a distance of over 100 miles. Now, let me talk about that real quick, because I said over 100 miles. When I did the calculation on this, the calculation coming back from what the Russians were saying was in excess of 120 miles. I think it actually was like 123 miles. But I'm just saying, hey, man, if you are 100 miles away, you're going to get your skin charred off. The ring of absolute destruction had a 28-mile radius where cellular life, everything's destroyed, buildings, fortification, trees, everything's gone within a 28-mile radius. It's
Like literally, when you
gone.
read about this, folks, it's dust. There is nothing left. And by the way, on the previous slide, I think we may have actually a typo. It says the SAR is 50 kilotons, but it's megatons. There's a big difference between a kiloton and a megaton. But can you imagine that, Rich, 120 miles away? So when we did our little testing the other day, we were up in the mountains north of Denver. We were about 70 miles away from the Cheyenne Mountain bunker, which is going to be targeted certainly. And we're like, what do we do? We were actually playing this with a couple of my shooting buddies on the way back, which they were terrified, by the way, after the trip. It was kind of a fun journey, by the way. But of course, they will probably target that thing with multiple kiloton, if I read the book correctly and read some of my other research correctly, multiple kiloton weapons, because that will have the effect of destroying some of these underground bunkers, which, Rich, I thought were undestroyable, but if I read it correctly, that's not the case. They're going to be destroyed. The Pentagon bunker is going to be destroyed. If there's one under near the White House, it's going to be destroyed. Cheyenne Mountain bunker is going to be destroyed, and pretty much everybody inside there is going to die. Was I wrong about that, or is that correct?
No, I don't think you're wrong about that, and I think they have penetrator warheads too. That's going to punch through a lot of layers, maybe even several. I don't know, 20 meters of granite. I'm making this stuff up. I don't know, folks, because there's nothing more classified than what we're talking about today. Now, of course, everything we're talking about is unclassified information. But if this is unclassified, imagine what's really behind the veil of secrecy, folks. So let's take a look at what did that Tsar bomb look like. It was roughly 25 tons, or about the same weight of 10 SUVs. It was dropped on an island in the Arctic Circle, and you can see here, this is where it hit that 28 miles of destruction. And you can also see from the infographic I put up here how far away it was visible. This actual mushroom cloud and the destruction was visible from as far away as Sweden, Norway, Finland, obviously Russia, the Baltic states. They could all see this thing detonate. Now, what happens if you go to nuclearsecrecy.com/nuke map, which I encourage you to do, you can blow up any city in the world you want, and it'll give you all the data relative to what would have happened. So playing with this last night, I decided, let's take a look what would happen if we dropped the Tsar bomb in Central Park. So if you can see the infographic, you can see those first layers are the radiation, the fireball, and then that gray area is the heavy blast where everything's going to be toppled and destroyed. And look, Newark is gone. Most of the satellite cities around New York are just complete, flat, dusty wastelands. And then, of course, you have that final orange area, which is the thermal radiation. That those places are going to be uninhabitable for 20,000 years or so. So this is unimaginable, folks. And that's just one.
That's one.
Yeah.
That's one, man. And then, of course, the after effect is something that is almost unbelievable. The firestorm and the temperature changes from the firestorm. An example of our deal the other day, it's like, hey, we're up in the mountains. Everybody thinks, hey, let's run to the mountains. We're going to be safe in the mountains. Well, most of the mountains in the continental U.S., all of the, Bighorn Mountains in Wyoming, where I'm from, and all of the Rocky Mountains in Colorado, and the Gravelies, if you look at the mountains in some of the forest systems, and those of you that travel out west, here's an interesting fun fact. When Rich and I travel to Montana every year to teach a class or go to those different areas, oftentimes there will be a forest fire somewhere in Montana or somewhere in California. And that forest fire will cause enough smoke where it will be slightly uncomfortable. Like you'll breathe it, you'll smell it in the morning. If it's a low-lying area like the range we taught at, it's like the smoke kind of sucks. And that's from one forest fire that may be hundreds, if not thousands of miles away, that is largely contained. Well, if you can imagine, let's just talk about the Cheyenne bunker right next to the Rocky Mountains and all of the trees, so multiple warheads of multiple kiloton and maybe megatonnage hit that area. It's going to cause a cataclysmic fire of unbelievable proportions in both the built up areas that are not immediately destroyed, but then all the mountain areas. So basically, if you can imagine where they're going to target Montana and Wyoming and different areas of North Dakota and certainly Colorado, where all of our nuclear command structure and bunkers are, all of the forests and all of those areas, probably almost in their entirety, specifically based on prevailing winds, will be on fire at one time. And
What
that
did we
doesn't
say,
sound
Mike? We're talking about with 123 miles away, third-degree burns on a human being. That means
right.
every pine cone is going to immediately,
Everyone,
instantaneously burst into flames.
everyone, and then just the heat and the wind caused by those terrifying forest fires. Like literally, imagine all of the forest in all of the United States, basically in essence, and probably let's just say it's a hot summer day in July, and they hit North Dakota with several nukes, and Kansas with several nukes, and certainly Montana in the grasslands. And because of the nuclear wave and the nuclear blast, now all of those grasslands are on fire, and there's a prevailing southeastern wind that's not only carrying radioactive debris and smoke, but is pushing that fire at 50 to 100 miles an hour across the country. So in a matter of days, almost the entire country will be burned.
It's a
Almost
cyclone of flames. Like I'm so
literally.
glad you said that, because I think a lot of people forget about the jet stream and the prevailing winds. So Cheyenne gets hit. Well, those wind systems going to carry it across the Great Plains. It's going to carry it across parts of the upper South and then all the way into New York, New England, and Canada. So even if you smack them, the fallout and the fires are coming for everybody else. So
And I think that's one of the things that we wanted to bring up. This is the original concept of the show, folks, was like the top 10 things you didn't know about nukes. And I know we're getting off of our PowerPoint, so I'll let Rich go through it here in a second. But these things are like unbelievable, because I know a lot of you listening right now or watching right now have probably been out west when there's a forest fire, and you've been around the smoke and you've been bothered by the smoke, and you're like, oh, that kind of sucks for several days or even weeks during the summer out in Montana. It's almost always a bothersome thing. Well, just think that's probably 1% of the forests that are on fire, maybe 1%. And when these attacks hit, if we get hit by 20 ICBMs, which is a very low number, by the way, let's just say 20 of them hit, I would say that the large majority of the western states' forests will be on fire. So we're talking about 1,000 times the smoke level. Now that's not just smoke, by the way. It's nuclear fallout and smoke. It's radioactive smoke that is being blown across the U.S. So even if maybe you have a homemade bunker, we'll talk about that in the preparation next week a little bit. How do there's the concept of surviving at that point in time becomes, I don't know, pure luck, or maybe extreme preparation for those that the rich and famous, and they got their billionaire bunkers. If I was a billionaire, Rich, I'd have a nice bunker. But those things I didn't think about. I didn't think about the fact that I've been bothered by smoke out west before, but this is going to be at a scale that's unbelievable.
It is, because it's going to lead to what our good friend Gile out there in the Philippines talks about, nuclear winter. And we'll get to that in a moment, Gile. But he says, the way I see it, there is no escape when the nuke detonates. Total wipeout of bright light, then nuclear winter. And if it only happened that fast, but it's not. This is going to be a slow death for plants and animals, me and you, and for most of human civilization. I want to help you visualize this, because this one was a wake up call for me. And I'm going to put it up there so you can see it. All the way on the left is Mount Everest. That little bitty bump is Mount Everest. And that little dot above Mount Everest is a plane, the height of the average cruising altitude of most commercial airliners. And then you can see Little Boy, the mushroom cloud that was dropped on Hiroshima. Fat Man, you can see the mushroom cloud dropped on Nagasaki. Castle Bravo, tested by the United States in 1954. And then all the way you have the Tsar Bomba. Look at it relative to Mount Everest. This is unimaginable.
It is unimaginable.
It's nothing but flame and fire.
It's unbelievable. But Rich, these graphics say 15,000 KT, 50,000 KT. That's kiloton. Is that correct? I think Castle Bravo was 15 megaton. I think
these are calculated in kiloton, so you have to translate, do the math.
Yeah. Okay.
I have, and all the sources are at the end of this, but yeah.
Right. Excellent. And by the way, when you look at that, folks, if it were 25 or 15 megaton, that's 15,000 kiloton, but that still means 15,000 tons TNT, man. By the way, speaking of Castle Bravo, that's a great example of the level of responsibility of the good old U.S. government back in the day, which all of the scientists or a lot of the scientists that helped work on the original project went to the president afterwards and said, "Hey, we have this new thing we're working on, but we don't think we should do it because it is literally pure evil. It is the end of humanity as we know it." And that was the thermonuclear warhead, which is basically a hydrogen, we call a hydrogen bomb, and there are a bunch of different additions where it's a bomb within a bomb. It's a nuclear yield within a nuclear yield. What is it, Rich? Fission and fusion. I don't know if it really matters, but the point is it's exponentially more powerful. And all of these major scientists went to the president and said, "Hey, we really, really, really shouldn't build this thing because this is the end of the planet as we know it. And then let's go ahead and build it anyways. And let's go ahead and test this 15 megaton nuke," which, by the way, they had, here's the level of responsibility we're talking about. They had purported it to be, what was it? I think it was supposed to be 5 meg or something like that. They were way off in their calculations. Oops. So the smartest scientists on the planet developed this thing, and they're wrong about their calculations, and they destroyed a lot more than they thought. They radiated all kinds of folks on a bunch of islands in that area. And here's the fun fact, Rich. I was telling this to the guys in the car the other day. The fun fact, some of the scientists actually believe because of the hydrogen in the air that we might possibly set the air on fire, the air around the planet Earth on fire. But you know what? We're kids playing with a firecracker, so let's just light the thing and see what happens, man. But hey, guys, just so you know, I'm not certain, but about half of us are betting we're going to destroy the planet, but we're going to do it anyways. Think about that for a second.
Right. No, you're absolutely right. And I think it was Edmund Teller that was, his calculations were showing it was going to destroy everything. And Oppenheimer and some of the other boys at the lab did some calculations. That will probably be fun. It's like, it's insane. And Castle Bravo was a nightmare, man. We irradiated and harmed and killed a lot of people in and around I think it was the Marshall Islands where they set that one off. Frank says, "My stepdad was at Castle Bravo. The safe distance they were at wasn't." Yes, sir. Gal says, "I've heard of that hydrogen bomb, the talk about that when the bomb can destroy half the planet." Yeah. Shan is on. Good morning, Shan. One of our sponsors over at works.com. Shan says, "Mutually assured destruction would be a nightmare scenario, emphasizes the need for diplomacy, de-escalation, and responsible statesmanship in modern times." And that's why I wanted to kind of lead with, if you look back to the beginning of the show, we talked about this incident that happened in 2022 where the Russian general called a lot of his counterparts and said, "Dude, we're about to pop a tactical nuke on these people. We cannot have them break through our lines and retake Crimea. That's a bridge too far for us. We're going to stop it. You need to do something." And it was only, journalists found out about it later. It should have been more of a Cuban Missile Crisis where you have the president come out and say, "Let me tell you what's going on, folks. These are the steps I'm taking, and be responsible adults about this instead of this back channel BS." Because I think, again, most of America just kind of run around with their heads up the rear end relative to this threat.
I think that's the point of this show. Like, literally, that's the point of the show. I mean, maybe we get in front of some more people on a podcast. I know Annie Jacobsen has done several podcasts. We are so focused on, I'm not even going to get into I'm not going to get into what the average, let's just say 20 to 30-year-old is focused on right now, but it's certainly not the things that they should be focused on, in my opinion. Rich, it's been a chaotic, crazy time frame. We're talking about COVID. We're talking about, the potential future of AI, which may be brilliant and awesome and incredible in terms of medicine and food crops that are almost going to be unbelievably flourishing. And the tipping point of technology by, in theory, based on what I've heard from some other guys, 2029, which is just down the road, 4 or 5 years away. But at the same time, we have the biggest potential threat of nuclear war that we ever have. And people listening, you 40-year-olds and 50-year-olds and folks that went through the Cold War that understand that, 60-year-olds and 70-year-olds, need to share it with your children and your grandchildren and say, "Hey, give this a listen. This is kind of a layman's wake-up call," and then let them start to research and look at things. And maybe as a human species, we can start freaking changing our focus and think, man, we want a little war here and there, global issues here and there, public issues, all the weird crap going on. Okay, got it. I'll take all that before I'll take the alternative the big bomb. It's just it's terrifying to me. It's really kept me up at night since I've read the book and my previous research. But it's really, really terrifying because, Rich, our roles in the American Warrior Society and individuals is protectors, right? We talk about protecting. We talk about getting our IFAC kit. We're carrying a firearm on a regular basis. I got my beautiful carry gun here. It's all irrelevant. It means nothing if we destroy our planet.
I'm so glad you said that, because next week's show, part 2, we're going to talk about preparedness. And of course, there is a kinetic piece of preparedness that we're going to go into, and that might be relevant for the IDPA community and for our 2A community. So there is a kinetic component that you can do to make yourself more prepared. But if you don't understand the threats that are out there, how do you know even how to start preparing? So I think that bringing the awareness is what we wanted to do. And in order to do that, we're going to have to look at some horrible pictures here, guys. I want to show you, not to fearmonger, but this threat is out there. Do with this information what you will. This is from Hiroshima. And now an interesting side note, an anecdotal note is, my father worked for Nakanishi Conveyor Company. It was a Japanese conveyor company. My dad was constantly going to Japan, and then he was friends with all these engineers. So during Christmas holidays, they didn't want to fly home to Japan, so they would come to our house. So every Christmas season, our house was flooded with 3, 4, 5 Japanese engineers. And one of them was teaching me some judo throws, and his shirt came up and I saw that he had a lot of scars on his back. And I'm like, oh, what happened? Did you get burned? He's like, no, my mother was pregnant with me at Hiroshima. And I had radiological burns through her stomach. And now his back was just a wall of scars. So I remember that, just kind of like, and here he is in my home. I'm getting chills just talking about it. Here he is in my home, an American who did this to his mother, and I'm sure destroyed a lot of his family and cousins and things of this nature. And yet here we were sharing Christmas together. So that gives me hope. But this is a picture from Hiroshima. This woman's face, as you can see, is burned off. And I just want to talk to you. When we say nuclear holocaust, I want to paint a picture, not unlike what Annie Jacobsen does. You need to understand something. When these bombs go off, these cities are destroyed. Broken sewers are going to ooze human waste into the streets. Broken gas mains are going to continue to spew flames into the sky and start additional fires that are going to rage across cities. Mike already talked about the fires coming out of the west once these places have been hit. Bridges are gone. Highways are going to be blocked by ruined cars. Rail lines are going to be torn to ribbons. And what that means is logistical supply that's going to try to come in and rebuild things are going to be hampered by they can't get to you. Bloated, discarded dead are going to be lying blackening in the streets in piles. The water is poisoned. The soil that you're going to want to grow a crop in to feed your family, that top 18 inches of soil is going to be irradiated. You're going to have to dig all the way down there and get fresh soil that you can actually grow something in. Black and irradiated rain is going to fall upon the living and the dead and burn the skin. Flies that are going to feed on the burnt flesh, folks, they're going to go around and make other people sick, carrying disease. Radiation sickness is going to take days, weeks, months, perhaps years to kill off people. And this is what I was talking to relative to Guile, like, hey, it's going to be a flash and it's over. Not necessarily. If you're one of the lucky ones, probably. Pregnancies will fail, or children will be born with horrific birth defects, like the Japanese friend of my father. The sick and the dying will storm the borders. And here's something else to think about. You think we have a border crisis now? Okay, well, it might be Americans heading to Canada, folks. They're going to storm the borders, bring in disease with them. Refugees will be everywhere. Displacement is going to be horrific. Cancer will be ubiquitous. Hair and teeth of people that you love are going to be falling out. Plants and animals will die by the tens of thousands, and starvation will rule the day. And my worst fear is men will begin to feed on other men. Once again, here's some pictures. As horrific as they may be, I'm glad someone had the courage to take these horrible photographs. These are people that are alive, folks. These aren't the dead. These are the living, which is even more horrific. These aren't corpses you're looking at here. These are human beings like me and you that are alive, perhaps barely.
And Rick, one of the things about the interesting once again. And when I say this, I want to make sure I'm painting this properly. If you're hearing this statement from me, and you have a family member that worked in the system and did things that you believed was American and protecting America, I respect. And a former Marine, Rich Brown is a former retired Marine. Certainly we are there as far as patriots and Americans. But the United States government dropped 2 nuclear weapons on a city of civilians on purpose with pre-calculated data to kill the most civilians possible to get the emperor to finally say, I surrender and give up. And a lot of folks politically will say, hey, they were on the way to surrender anyways. That's a political discussion I'm not interested in getting into. But the point is, after that point in time, when nuclear testing was still viable and not illegal, which, by the way, afterwards, I think we broke the law and did some testing anyways. So nuclear testing was specifically so we could calculate data to drop nuclear weapons and destroy bunkers or destroy things that were buried, which is, by the way, the only way to escape a nuclear blast is to not be there. And underground is the only possible safe. The second testing and data is to see how much destruction there was and how do we possibly do an airburst to kill the most people and destroy the most infrastructure. So we, as an entity, and our counterparts in Russia and other countries have spent trillions of dollars testing simply so we have the ability to kill more people and destroy more things as a planet of humans with one sole existence purpose. And that's, in theory, to survive and procreate and live. Think about that.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I'm reticent when I hear people say a nuclear war cannot be won and therefore it cannot be fought. We've won a nuclear war. There's a very uncomfortable thing to hear. We won the only nuclear war. I think it was a justified release of nuclear weapons. I'm not saying it wasn't, because if you look at all the options that were available to them at the time, especially Okinawa was a test bed. I don't want to get in too far back into World War II's history, but you saw the Battle of Okinawa, one tiny little island. You got 20,000 Americans dead, another probably 60,000 Okinawans dead, and then you calculate that relative to mainland Japan. It was probably in the best interest of everybody. If the emperor wasn't going to surrender, we're going to have to do something to make you surrender. Now, here's the problem. The genie's out of the bottle. The Russians have them. Our enemies have them. Our allies have them. So it's not just we're the only one with the big stick. Now, I would imagine that nuclear war cannot be fought, that the nature of war has changed in a way that we don't ever want to go down this road again. It is just too horrific. And that's why you see trench warfare still going on in Ukraine. We're back to fighting, a 19th century war, an 18th century war. Because we know the horror a nuclear war would unleash, not just now, not in the days and weeks that it's fought, but for thousands of years.
Yeah.
Let's take a look at this, Mike, because we talked about the Holocaust. We looked at some ugly pictures, but I also want to include this in here. So this is a very, very limited nuclear war. This is the starvation rates around the world that this would cause. And you can see in places like Canada, you would have almost anywhere from 75% to 100% starvation. Why? Because they're already reliant upon other places that have agriculture to bring in food. So therefore, it would be harder on them. Maybe South America would be a good place to go in a very limited war. Maybe Australia. But I mean, one of the things we don't think about if there is some sort of nuclear exchange in Ukraine, that's the breadbasket, man. There are more grain coming out of Ukraine than perhaps anywhere else in the world. And yet that would be irradiated and destroyed. So how many people would starve, even if we could just contain it to something like the Ukraine? But let's say it goes off the rails, my friend. These are the starvation calculations, and I apologize if you're listening. You're going to have to download the PDF or watch the show. But we're talking about world starvation rates for most countries, 75 to 100%.
Yeah, basically, folks, if you were looking at this, it's the entire planet. You look at South America and Australia are potentially surviving the starvation. But here's the reality, Rich. One of the things that we talked about in Game Storm the other day was, let's say this whole thing happens, and maybe there's 100 or maybe there's 1,000 cruise ships out there on the ocean right now, and there's 100,000 under other ships and other boats that maybe if the EMP waves don't shut their power down and they have the ability to get to someplace safe, there will be no safe harbor on the east or west coast of the U.S. There'll be no safe harbor anywhere in Europe. So they're going to head south. So we're talking about a massive migration. If in theory, what do you think they're going to do in Australia? They're not going to open their borders, right, to the good old jolly Americans that somehow got on a boat and got down there. There are going to be millions and millions of people flocking to those countries, like literally. Of course, there'll be millions and millions of people dead, but conceptually, once again, think about this, folks. It's almost unbelievable. When I think through this, I constantly think about the fact that it's 2024. We've survived COVID. We've gone through all these things. We got the impending possibilities of AI, or maybe potentially the impending threat of AI. You could look at that. That could be an entire other show. But Rich, it's ridiculous that we are at a place where our political entities and global leaders and crazies like the loser over in North Korea that has citizens that don't understand what is outside their borders in any way, shape, or form could potentially start or tip the first domino in a thermonuclear global war, which none of us are going to survive.
Let's talk about that. This is something we haven't touched on, but I think it's very, very important. Annie Jacobsen brings it up in her book, and that is every nuclear armed country in the world, anytime they launch anything in space, a satellite, any kind of rocket that leaves the Earth, we notify all the other countries like, hey, this is what we're doing. It's going to go off at 0936 Central Time. It's going to achieve an altitude of XYZ. It's going to fall here, blah, 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 right? So everybody's read in on the script. Everybody acknowledges it. Guess who doesn't do it? North Korea.
Of course.
When they fire something up, it's up to us to try to figure out what it is and where it's going. And one of these days, we may make a mistake. Yeah. And that's the whole point of this, right?
And here's another fun fact, and forgive me if it's in your PowerPoint too, Rich. Here's the deal, folks. One of the things that I didn't realize, and I'm letting some of the scenario out of the bag in the book. I know most of you that are listening to this eventually will buy the book and read it anyways. But so just imagine North Korea launches an attack that we calculate came from them. It's going to hit us. It does hit us, and we launch a counterattack. To launch a counterattack on North Korea, our ICBMs have to travel toward Russia and over Russia. Well, one of the things that we haven't talked about in detail is the fact that our targeting systems, meaning our ability to detect a nuclear launch, where it came from, where it's going to hit, is very advanced with some satellites and radars and other different devices out there, where Russia has something similar, but not nearly as good. Not surprising. Russia doesn't have the same technology. Things are not built as well like they are in the U.S. I think most people would probably agree with that. But they, of course, see this launch from the U.S. where we're targeting North Korea, and we're going to put a couple ICBMs on North Korea that have to fly over Russia. So they have to make this determination: is this the U.S. attacking us? Because their targeting data doesn't specifically tell them, or may not specifically tell them, no, they're launching nukes on North Korea because North Korea just launched on them. So that's the possibility of not just a quick return where you have this madman in North Korea that if you told me, like literally as we're having this podcast and recording, that there's a submarine that's about to launch, or they're going to launch a nuclear ICBM from North Korea, I'd be like, yeah, I totally believe that based on the information I have right now. And our counterattack is what causes, in the book, a counterattack by Russia. I'm sorry, Annie Jacobsen, if you're listening to this right now, someone forwards this podcast to you.
Spoiler alert.
Spoiler alert. Hey, sorry, but if you're not a reader and you're not going to read the book, I want you to understand some of these things I didn't realize. Like, oh, duh, that makes sense, right?
And I want to North Korea last year, I believe it was launched, and I forget the name of this sub. It's named like the Great, Majestic, Powerful Kim Jong, whatever. But it's code numbers like 81 or something. Why am I bringing it up? Because all they did was retrofit an old Russian diesel sub. Okay, whoop-de-doo. It's not a nuclear power sub, but it can launch nuclear missiles. Okay. So yes, it may have to surface a little bit more than ours do, but it's still carrying nuclear weapons on board. And we're talking about this crazy guy. So Mike just talked about him launching an ICBM. It's going to take 30 minutes to get here, but it doesn't if it's sitting, underneath the Golden Gate Bridge and decides to pop one in San Francisco. So this is a legitimate threat. This guy is uncontrollable, and who knows what he may or may not do. Because remember, to them, we are just at a ceasefire. That the war of the Korean War did not resolve. There was no surrender. There was an armistice, and that armistice still holds today. But we've seen instances like the USS Pueblo, where they seized an American ship, and it's still sitting in Pyongyang. We never got it back. You can, if you were ever in North Korea, which I don't advise you to do, you could take a tour of the USS Pueblo. They tortured our sailors, and it took about a year for us to get them back. So to them, this war is ongoing, which is why I think they pose a threat, unlike maybe Russia, which would probably make some more mature decisions. China would probably make some more mature decisions. Hell, even India and Pakistan. But North Korea is a wild card that we need to take seriously.
Yeah, they're scary.
Let's talk about Shan's comment here. It says current lawmakers are pointing to the U.S. use of nuclear weapons in World War II as a justification to use nukes today. I don't trust these people to protect our borders, let alone be in control of nukes today. And I have to absolutely agree with him on that. A couple more slides here and we'll be done with today's show. But Mike earlier talked about the ash and dust that would be thrown in the air that we already see when we travel out to beautiful places like Montana, Wyoming, Oregon, where the dust is in the air. What level are we talking about? We're talking about potentially 5 million tons of dust that would be lifted into the stratosphere and blanket the world in darkness for years and years to come. We're talking about global temperatures falling many degrees Celsius and probably 2 billion people on Earth dying. That's almost every third human being alive today would be dead. Not from the radiation, not from just from the nuclear winter, the starvation that would befall us. Because guess what, folks? When the sunlight is not getting down to the plants, they can't do that beautiful thing called photosynthesis. When they can't continue to grow and thrive, animals that we eat can't eat them, and then therefore they die, and then we die. So this is just a little bit of the sources that were used in today's show. I want to thank each and every one of these sources. In the days that I took to put this together, I pulled from a lot of different sources to try to aggregate this data into something that was maybe palatable for you guys, that we could spend about an hour and a half on, and you could learn something, because a lot of times we forget that to aggregate this data is incredibly difficult. One of the folks watching today says, why isn't the U.S. explaining this? Why aren't they getting out in front of this information? I don't know why they want to keep people in the dark. I guess it's, to keep the economy humming along, which is fine on some level. But for those of us that are in the preparedness space, take these threats somewhat more serious than the general population, it's I don't know, Mike.
I don't know either. I think, if I were to make I want to throw out some fun facts that we haven't really talked about, but if I were to make an estimate or maybe give an answer to that, I think, and this is just my personal opinion, I just think that the average political entity, the U.S. president, his party, his representatives, people that are one side or the other side, and you can argue side back and forth, and that's part of the problem, is there's side to side. They're two distinct sides on either equation, and either of those sides is so focused on their political affluence and their vote and getting voted back in. They're maybe certainly they're thinking about global thermonuclear war, but they're really not taking the steps to do much about it. Or at least in my opinion, if I'm wrong about that, someone prove me wrong. Well, send us an email and tell me what Biden has done or Trump did when he was the president, or Obama did to lessen the threat of global thermonuclear warfare. Some other fun facts, by the way. After a nuclear war, as humans continue to die, and this average mammal dies, and the birds die, and the bees die because of the radiation, insects tend to thrive. They have an outer hard shell. They tend to thrive in radioactive environments. So we're talking about cockroaches and all the insects that will spread disease, the flies that carry on, they're disease carrying rodents, et cetera, et cetera. They're going to probably thrive, believe it or not, in a nuclear war. Because they're going to have a lot of food. So you can imagine that millions and millions and millions of people that have third-degree burns are going to probably go to water or try to find water. She describes this in the book. And then I would have a hard time believing this, but maybe then the nuclear winter, maybe the nuclear attack happens in the summer, the temperature drops potentially, degrees and degrees and degrees, which means that Canada and northern states will largely freeze, and you have all of these different dead bodies in the water that eventually 5 or 10 or 15 years later may thaw out and continue to rot and continue to exist in our planet. Now, once again, the fun fact is all of this radioactivity that falls back to the United States after you come out of your bunkers that is on the ground up to 18 inches deep will eventually be affected by rain, and it's going to wash into small streams, which are going to wash into small rivers, which are all going to end up in the ocean, which of course contains a large amount of the food that we rely on right now, which, by the way, we're killing the oceans off anyways. But imagine after a global thermonuclear war, how much we're going to kill off in the oceans themselves. Now, on the planet, on the land, things don't grow. We've destroyed our air. We've destroyed our ozone layer. It's going to be fun times, a lot of fun facts that we can look forward to after this thing. And by the way, you look at one of the things that we talked about, or we didn't talk about in this show, but they talk about in several different books is what it's like to attack a nuclear power plant and what happens to the radioactive debris that's spewed by this attack, which apparently they have targeted as well. If you look at Chernobyl is a dead zone, and it's going to be a dead zone for thousands of years. Not like, hey, let's wait 100 years or let's wait. That happened way back, in the 60s. We should be able to go there now. The radioactivity has no. Guess what? Thousands of years, thousands and thousands of years. These spots will be highly radioactivity. No one will be able to live in those areas. So imagine a generation that survives this thing and comes out of bunkers, let's say in 20 or 30 years, and then tries to survive on a planet in an area that has these global hotspots that will not be safe for thousands of years unless we come up with some sort of technology and we can somehow reverse the radioactivity. Of maybe that's what all these aliens are flying around in spaceships that they're getting ready to help us out after we nuke ourselves. But just, Rich, so many fun facts. If you're listening to today's podcast, sorry, but it's the fact. And I think the more of us know, if 100 people listen to the show or 1,000 people, and you all share that, and 100,000 people hear this, maybe we can affect this and speak to our politicians, or at least educate each other and say, enough is enough. Let's live the beautiful sunset of technology as we're about to be so smart. We could probably feed ourselves forever, right? And produce food and do great things.
Yeah, on some level, we're apes with a lightsaber, man. I mean, we have control of technology we're probably not ready to have. We as in the collective we, right? I'm sure there are people out there that are smart enough to do this, but when you put them all together, it's we're a bunch of monkeys with lightsabers. Now, my concern is there's a lot. There's things we didn't get into today. We kind of talked about North Korea, kind of talked about Russia, the Ukraine war. I mean, we said this would never happen. Another war in Europe, and yet here we are. We're 2 years into it. And it's almost like a bloody stalemate. And where is it going to go from here? I mean, once the Ukraine does get these F-16s, I think it's going to change the thing. Once they do get depleted uranium rounds, how will Russia react to that once some of their troops get radiated? It's going to happen, guys. So where are we going? Then you have to look at China doing these giant military exercises in surrounding Taiwan. What if those ships didn't sail away and the blockade stayed? What does mutually assured destruction look like with China relative to Taiwan? Taiwan could be like, yeah, you can come in and take it, but the minute you land on the beach, I'm going to blow up TSMC, these large semiconductor plants. So the things that you think you're going to get, I promise you will not be here. We're in a weird time, which is why the PhDs and Nobel laureates that run the doomsday clock through their analysis, like, guys, we've never been in a worse spot. So I hate to kind of end it there, Mike, but show up again next Wednesday, 09:30 Central Time for part 2, where we'll kind of talk about some of the things that you can do to keep you and your family and your community safer, right?
Yeah, folks. And by the way, that the preparedness part two, these steps will also be globally applicable to all kinds of other things, to
Yes.
other disasters, other
All
situations,
hazard preparedness. That's
all
it.
hazard preparedness. We're going to talk about hard skills. We're going to talk about things you can do. And the reality is, if a nuke explodes tomorrow within a range that kills me, thank you for listening to the podcast. It was nice knowing you all. Same thing to you all. That's just a reality we have to face. And some of us may say, well, if it blows up, I certainly hope it dies, and I'm not one of the survivors. Rich, one of my nightmares, and we'll end with this, is it's not that I necessarily die and my family dies, but that I'm still alive somewhere and I'm not able to get to them, and I have to fight through that, and or I'm still alive and now I'm in this world for maybe it's just days, until the fallout comes, or maybe it's weeks. What do I do for those weeks? What do I do, to protect my family? And that's what we're going to talk about next week.
Yeah. Well, Mike, thank you, folks that watched today's show. Kept you on here an hour and 40 minutes. Mike, you want to take us out, sir?
Yeah, unfortunately, in this subject, I hope we're wrong, but the fight is coming, folks. Be ready.